The sky over Station Oran 9 was always quiet, until the night the fire fell. The humans called it a diplomatic visit. The Thalrani called it something else. When the dropships came, they weren't carrying gifts or greetings. They carried soldiers, with black armor and silent weapons. No one had expected war to begin on a peace station. Especially not Eric Yallen, the quiet human engineer who fixed pipes and ignored politics. He had never spoken to the royal family of Varelia. Why would he? They were tall, glowing, and distant. Royal aliens with ancient blood and strict customs. Eric was a nobody. That was what he believed, until the blast door blew open and the green-skinned princess fell into his arms, bleeding from her side. Princess Thalara had never touched a human before. Her people thought humans were soft, weak, emotionally unstable. But as her vision blurred and the fire alarms screamed, one pair of strong arms held her like she was more than just a royal title. He didn't ask for her name. He just dragged her to safety while dodging gunfire. Eric didn't know why he chose to protect her. He could have run, others did. The station's command crew had already escaped in escape pods. But when he saw the look in her eyes, pain, confusion, and fear, something in him shifted. He fought off two armored invaders with nothing but a wrench in his fists. He bled. He fell. But he stood back up. They found shelter behind the ruined med bay. Eric was already bruised and cut, and Thalara's wound wasn't slowing down. She tried to sit up, but her strength failed her. The floor trembled as enemy soldiers searched room by room. Still, Eric covered her with his body, using his back as a shield. The princess looked at the blood on his arm. "It wasn't hers. You should have left me," she whispered, voice barely audible through the smoke. He shook his head without speaking. Words didn't matter, not here, not now. She didn't understand him, not fully. But the way he looked at her, like her life meant something, spoke louder than words. The invaders passed by. They never looked behind the broken med bed. When the silence returned, Thalara reached out and touched the human's face. She had never seen one up close. His skin was pale, his eyes full of storm. He wasn't a soldier, yet he had risked everything. For her, it made no sense. She belonged to a people who thought humans were below them. Somewhere outside, explosions shook the station again. Eric stood, staggering, and offered his hand to her. She hesitated. Royals don't take help from lesser beings. But her hand rose. Her fingers curled around his palm. In that moment, she broke more than protocol. She broke the wall between their kinds. They moved through fire-lit halls. He led her carefully, avoiding collapsed ceilings and flickering security drones. At one point, he shoved her aside and took the brunt of a falling beam. His shoulder dislocated, and he bit his tongue so hard it bled. Still, he pushed forward. Still, he guided her like her life mattered more than his own. When they reached the hangar, it was too late. The ships were gone. Only the wrecks of fighters and fuel leaks remained. Eric collapsed beside a crate, breathing hard, his shirt soaked in blood. Thalara sat beside him and looked at the red smears on her fingers. She had never felt this powerless, or this protected. "You shouldn't have." "Help me," she said again. Her voice was heavier now, regretful. Eric smiled slightly and shrugged with his uninjured shoulder. "Maybe I wanted to," he replied. She didn't fully understand the words, but she understood the tone. No fear, no regret. Just truth, then. The hangar doors creaked open again. Eric jumped in front of her without thinking. But it wasn't the enemy this time. It was her sisters. Princess Thalina and Princess Villana, both dressed in battle armor, both shocked to see their youngest sibling covered in a human's blood. More shocked to see the human still standing, despite his wounds. Villana pointed her weapon at Eric at first. Protocol demanded it, but her eyes locked onto the blood on his hands. Then to Thalara's bruises. then to the way the princess stood. Close to him, protected by him, touched by him. The air between them was thick with tension. Thalia lowered her weapon slowly. "He protected you?" she asked. Thalia nodded once. Eric said nothing. His breath was ragged. He could barely stand. But he still placed himself in front of her, as if danger hadn't passed. That one action made the other sisters look at him differently. For the first time, they saw not a human, but a warrior. A man who had no armor, no orders, and no royal blood, yet fought harder than anyone for their kin. In that moment, he was no longer just a man from Earth. He was something else entirely. The emergency lights flickered inside the ruined hangar as Eric leaned against a broken support beam. His legs trembled from blood loss, but he refused to sit. Thalia stood behind him, watching her sisters approach with both relief and confusion. They were supposed to be safe now, but something in the air felt different. Princess Thalia stepped forward first. Her armor was scratched and scorched from battle. Her eyes scanned Eric up and down, noting every bruise, every cut, every line of blood. He didn't lower his guard, not even when she stopped just a few steps away. There was no fear in his face, only quiet strength. Thalia followed, her expression harder to read. She had always been colder than her sisters, more disciplined. But her sharp eyes locked on the bond between Thalia and the human. The way Thalia stood close. The way she touched his arm to keep him steady. That connection could not be ignored. "You saved her," Thalia said plainly. Eric gave a small nod. His lips were dry and cracked. He didn't need to speak. The blood on the floor told the story for him. His silence only made him appear more solid, more dependable. Thalia moved beside him and looked directly at her sisters. "He nearly died protecting me," she said. "He bled because I couldn't stand. He didn't leave me behind." The words echoed in the chamber. For once, none of the sisters had a reply ready. Thalia finally broke the silence. "Why?" she asked Eric. "You're not one of us. You had nothing to gain." Eric's eyes met hers. He spoke softly, but the weight of his words carried through the hangar. "I don't need a reason to protect someone who's bleeding in front of me." The simplicity struck them harder than any weapon. Thalia stepped closer and reached for Thalia's hand. She examined the dried blood, the bruises, the exhausted face of her younger sister. Then she turned her gaze back to Eric. "You fought off 3 armed soldiers with no armor, no gun, and no backup. That's not bravery. That's madness," she said. But her voice was not mocking. It was full of wonder. Eric gave a tired smirk. "Probably both," he said. Thalia smiled faintly beside him. The sisters exchanged looks. Something had changed. In this room, something unspoken. The human was no longer just a man caught in the chaos. He was part of their story now. Outside the hangar, the station's alert sirens stopped. The power systems began to stabilize. Reinforcements from Varelia had arrived at last. Medical shuttles landed with precision, and the wounded were rushed to safety. But inside this one chamber, the focus remained on the human and the 3 princesses. A medic tried to pull Eric away for treatment, but Thalia stepped between them. "He stays near me," she said firmly. The medic hesitated. One nod from Thalia made it clear her words were to be obeyed. Eric was carried gently into the royal ship, still flanked by the sisters. The ship's interior was pure white and gold, filled with humming energy and soft light. Eric had never seen anything like it. He didn't belong here, and he knew it. But no one stopped him. Thalia sat beside him and pressed a cool cloth to his wounds. Her touch was soft, careful. She had never tended anyone before. Royals had servants for such things. Thalia watched from across the room. Her arms were crossed, but her expression was less cold now, more thoughtful. She couldn't understand why this human mattered to her sister so quickly. But a part of Her wanted to understand. She had seen many warriors in her life. Few bled for someone else's life without orders. Thalenya stood near the viewing glass, looking out at the damaged station. She spoke quietly. This war wasn't supposed to come to Oran 9. We thought the humans would stay out of it. Her voice had no blame, only reflection. Thalara answered gently. One didn't stay out. And now he's part of it. Whether he likes it or not, they arrived at the healing sanctum. It was reserved only for royal family members. Yet Thalara didn't hesitate to bring Eric inside. The guards questioned her. She only had to say one thing. He bled for me. They opened the doors without another word. As the med pods activated and Eric was gently placed inside, his breathing slowed. The royal healers worked silently, amazed that a human had taken so much punishment and still walked. They had seen warriors from 100 worlds, but few had scars made for someone else's survival. Thalara sat beside the pod. Villana remained near the door, arms still folded. Thalenya walked slowly to the human's side and looked down at him. He could have died, she said quietly. He chose not to. Her voice carried something unfamiliar respect. Villana didn't respond right away. Her eyes stayed on Eric's face. I want to know why, she whispered to herself. Why? Does he matter now? She didn't know the answer. But she knew one thing clearly. She wanted to find out. Eric opened his eyes slowly. The ceiling above him glowed softly with golden light. His body felt light, almost too light, and every breath came easy. For a moment, he thought he had died. But then a shadow leaned over him. It was Thalara. You're awake, she said quietly. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were red as if she hadn't slept. Eric blinked a few times. The room was warm and clean. His wounds were gone. The pain had faded. He sat up slowly, surprised at how strong he felt. Thalara placed a hand on his shoulder and guided him back down gently. You were in the healing sanctum for 2 days, she explained. The healers said your body responded quickly, even better than expected. Eric looked at his arm where the deepest cut had been. Only smooth skin remained. His body may have healed, but his mind was still catching up. Outside the chamber, Villana stood with folded arms, watching everything. She hadn't left the corridor since he was brought in. She claimed it was to protect her sister. But the way her eyes followed Eric suggested something else. Something she hadn't named yet. Thalenya had returned to the Royal Council to report the incident. Yet before leaving, she gave Eric a nod of respect that few humans had ever received from her kind. It wasn't an order or a command. It was something deeper. A silent approval. Eric finally sat up fully and looked around the chamber. The walls shimmered with slow-moving light patterns. The air smelled of alien flowers and clean energy. He turned to Thalara. What happens now? He asked. She hesitated before answering. Now you meet my father. The idea hit him like a sudden wave. Meeting the king of Varelia was not something he had prepared for. He was just an engineer, a station tech, not a diplomat, not a warrior. But before he could argue, Thalara placed her hand on his chest. He asked to meet the human who bled for his daughter. Guards escorted them through curved halls lined with alien crystal. Every royal passed them in silence, some watching with surprise, others with quiet judgment. No one said a word. No one dared to. Eric walked beside Thalara, his step steady. He didn't know what to expect. He just knew he wouldn't run. They entered the throne room, a massive hall of blue stone and living vines that pulsed with light. At the far end sat King Varellin, tall and silver-skinned, wearing a robe that shimmered like liquid starlight. His eyes were glowing orbs of emerald, cold and unreadable. Eric bowed awkwardly. He had never bowed to a king before. Varellin did not speak at first. He stood, walked forward, and studied the human with slow, careful steps. Every guard in the room stood tense. Then the king spoke. "You shed blood for a daughter of my line." "Why?" Eric lifted his head. "Because she needed help," he said plainly. Varellin looked at Thalara, then back at Eric. "And if it had cost your life?" Eric nodded without pause. "It would have been worth it." The silence was long. Then the king extended his hand. "Few of my own kind would have done the same. You are not what I expected from a human." Eric shook the offered hand. It was cold and strong. The room relaxed. The danger passed. Later, as they exited the hall, Thalara walked quietly beside him. She didn't speak, but her closeness said enough. Velana waited outside, arms still crossed. But when she looked at Eric now, her gaze had softened. "He didn't flinch," she said to her sister. "Not even before the king." Thalara smiled lightly. "I told you," she replied. "He's not like the others." Velana said nothing more. But as Eric passed her, she followed. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. That night, Eric sat in the guest chamber offered to him. The bed was too soft. The walls glowed too bright. But he couldn't sleep. He wasn't used to royal comfort. He had spent his life in maintenance shafts, not palaces. He stood near the window and stared into the alien night. The door chimed. He turned. Velana stood there, armored still, her face unreadable. "I came to ask a question," she said. Eric nodded and stepped aside. She entered slowly. "When you stood in front of Thalara, you didn't know if you would survive, did you?" He shook his head. "No, I didn't." She watched him for a moment. "Would you have done the same for me?" The question was unexpected. Eric looked at her without blinking. "If you were bleeding and afraid?" "Yes, I would have." She looked away, as if hiding her expression. Then she nodded once and left. Alone again, Eric sat down and stared at the place where she had stood. He wasn't sure what was changing, but something was. In the eyes of the Varellian royals, he was no longer just a man. He was something more, and the more they saw of him, the more they wanted to know why. The next morning, Eric stepped into the royal garden, guided by one of the palace attendants. Varellian flora shimmered with colors he had never seen. Plants moved slightly as if they breathed. The air smelled of sweet spice and clean wind. It didn't feel like a place made for someone like him, but he wasn't alone. Thalara sat near a curved fountain, brushing her long hair with careful strokes. When she saw him, her smile was soft and shy. "You're healing well," she said. Eric nodded, unsure how to respond. She had treated him like a friend. Now she looked at him like something more. They sat together by the fountain. Birds of crystal wings flew overhead. The sounds of the city were distant and quiet. Thalara turned to him and asked a question he hadn't expected. "Do you miss your home?" Eric looked up at the blue sky. "I don't know if I had one," he said. "I lived where work took me." Thalara tilted her head. "Then maybe this is where you start to build one." Her words carried weight. He didn't know what they meant exactly, but her voice was gentle and true. For a long moment, they said nothing. Just sat in silence, the sound of water flowing beside them. Velana entered the garden with her usual serious look. She didn't interrupt. She simply stood nearby, watching. Eric noticed her and gave a polite nod. She stepped closer, hands behind her back. "We have a meeting with the War Council," she said to Thalara. "Father wants him." "There too." Eric blinked. "Me?" Velana nodded. "You faced the enemy. You saw what they did to Orin 9. The council needs to hear from someone who bled for this cause." Her words were sharp but respectful. She didn't speak in flattery. She spoke in fact. They left the garden together. Thalara walked beside Eric. Velana followed slightly behind. The halls they passed through were filled with stained glass and glowing tiles. Guards and nobles paused to watch them. Whispers followed in their wake. A human walking with two royal daughters was something unheard of. The council room was wide and circular. Floating orbs hovered above each seat, projecting maps and tactical data. Generals and advisors stood at attention. When Eric entered, the room paused. Some narrowed their eyes. Others looked surprised. But King Virelin stood at the center and gestured toward Eric. "This is the human who fought to protect my daughter," he said. "He will speak with us today." No one objected. Eric was guided to a seat beside Thalara. Valana took her place across from him. The meeting began. Eric listened carefully as reports came in. The enemy, the Shari, had broken several treaties and were expanding fast. Orin-9 had been a test. They wanted to see how far they could go without full retaliation. The Virelian Council was divided. Some wanted to strike back hard. Others feared more bloodshed. When Eric was asked for his view, he spoke slowly but clearly. They didn't just attack a station. They hunted the weak first. The ones who couldn't fight. That tells me they aren't looking for war. They're looking for fear. His words echoed in the chamber. A silence followed. Then one of the older generals spoke. "And what would you do, human?" Eric didn't hesitate. "Protect. Those they think are helpless. Show them we're not afraid." The answer was simple. But sometimes, simple truth was the loudest voice in the room. The council dismissed after an hour. As they exited, Valana walked beside Eric. "You surprised them," she said. Eric gave a tired smile. "I surprised myself." She glanced at him sideways. "You speak like a soldier, but you wear no rank." Eric looked ahead. Maybe I never needed one. Later that evening, Thalinia returned to the palace. She entered Eric's chamber without warning, carrying a metal case. "A gift," she said, placing it on the table. Eric opened it slowly. Inside was a ceremonial blade, carved with Virelian symbols. "This belonged to the last outsider who defended our bloodline." That was 400 years ago. Eric picked up the blade carefully. It was light but strong. He had never been honored like this before. "Why give it to me?" he asked. Thalinia stepped closer. "Because I see what you're becoming. And I want you to carry something that proves it." He nodded respectfully. Thalinia turned to leave but stopped at the door. "Be careful with my sisters," she said without looking back. "They're stronger than they seem. But not when it comes to you." That night, Eric stood alone in the hall outside his room. Valana appeared quietly from the other end. She didn't speak at first. Then she said, "You shouldn't be in our world, yet you walk through it like you belong." Eric replied, "Do you want me to leave?" Valana stared at him for a long time. "No," she said finally. Eric stood in the training hall, surrounded by warriors who had trained since childhood. He held the ceremonial blade Thalinia had gifted him. It was light in his grip, but it carried weight and meaning. Across from him stood Valana, dressed in her sleek dark armor, arms crossed and eyes sharp. "You don't have to prove anything," she said. Eric stepped forward and raised the blade. "I know," he answered, "but I want to." Valana gave a small nod. She called over 2 trainers and gave a command. The duel would be clean. No harm intended. Just respect through combat. The 2 Virelian warriors circled Eric slowly. They were faster, more precise. But Eric was used to chaos. He moved like someone who had learned to survive without rules. He blocked the first strike and ducked the second. He rolled and rose with the blade in perfect grip. He didn't try to win. He just refused to fall. Valana watched closely. Every move he made was different from their style. Rougher, more instinctual, yet effective. She saw him take a hit to the ribs but keep going. He took another to the shoulder and still stood tall. When the match ended, both warriors saluted him. "You fight like a man with no past," one of them said. Eric smiled through the pain. "That's because I left mine behind a long time ago." The warriors nodded and walked off. Valana stepped forward and looked at the red mark on his ribs. "You didn't have to go that far," she said. Eric shrugged. "You wouldn't respect me if I didn't." That afternoon, the royal family gathered in the Starlight Chamber. Thalara sat beside. Her father, Thalinia, stood with the council members. Vilina stood close to Eric. He noticed the distance between each sister. It wasn't anger. It was tension. Something unspoken had started to build. King Varellin raised his hand. A map hovered in the air. The Shari are moving again. They're preparing to strike our outer colonies. We need someone to deliver a keel. Warning to the frontier before they arrive. The room was silent. Thalinia stepped forward. "Send one of our ships. A royal escort." "They'll listen if it carries our voice," Vilana interrupted. "They'll listen better if it carries something unexpected." "Send him." All eyes turned to Eric. He looked at her in surprise. She stepped forward. "He's not one of us. But he's earned more trust in days than our diplomats have in years. Let him speak for us." Thalinia frowned. "He's not ready." Thalara stood up. "He's more ready than anyone else I've seen." The room grew quiet. The king turned. To Eric, "Would you go?" Eric looked at all three sisters, then at the map. Then he nodded. That night, Thalara came to his chamber. She stood at the doorway, hands clasped. "I don't want you to go alone," she said. Eric sat on the edge of the bed, polishing the blade. "You think I won't come back?" She shook her head. "I think I'll miss you before you even leave." He stood and walked to her. For a moment, they didn't speak. Then she reached out and took his hand. "If this goes well, it might stop a war." Eric nodded. "And if it doesn't?" Thalara looked down. "Then I want to know you tried for peace." Later, Vilana entered silently. Thalara was already gone. She stepped closer than usual. Her voice was quiet. "You bleed, you fight, you walk into danger. But you never ask for anything. Why?" Eric looked at her carefully. "Because asking feels like weakness." Vilana shook her head. "It doesn't, not to me." She reached into her armor and pulled out a pendant. It glowed with violet light. "This belonged to my mother. She gave it to me to protect someone I trusted with my life. I never used it. I'm giving it to you now." She placed it in his hand and stepped back. Eric looked down at the pendant, then at her. "I'll bring it back," he said. Vilana didn't smile, but her eyes said more than words. She turned and left without another word. Eric stood alone, staring at the glowing charm. He had no royal blood, no title, but now he carried the trust of more than one royal daughter. At dawn, the transport ship awaited him. Thalara stood near the ramp. Vilana stayed on the high balcony. Thalinia arrived last, handing him a sealed message. "If they don't listen, at least make them think." Eric nodded and stepped aboard. As the engines roared to life, he looked out the window. Three sisters stood watching from different places. Three pairs of eyes. Three hearts touched by one human who never expected to matter. And now, the stars waited for his voice. Asterisk hummed as it entered the outer regions of Varelian space. Eric stood in the command bay, staring out at the stars. The message crystal from Thalinia sat secured in his hand. The pendant from Vilana hung around his neck. And the memory of Thalara's voice still echoed in his mind. The pilot, a quiet Varelian soldier named Karen, glanced at him. "We'll reach the frontier colony in 2 hours," she said. "They've already picked up our signal." Eric nodded without turning away from the window. This mission was simple in words but heavy in meaning. He wasn't trained for diplomacy. He wasn't part of any command. But he carried the words of 3 royal daughters and the trust of a king. That made him more than just a man on a ship. It made him a symbol of something new. When the colony came into view, Eric could see the defensive turrets already active. The locals were nervous. They had every right to be. The Shari attacks had pushed many into panic. Eric took a deep breath as the ship docked. He adjusted his clothes, hiding the pain still lingering in his shoulder. A Varelian elder met him. At the landing bay, her eyes narrowed when she saw a human. "They sent you?" she asked. Eric didn't flinch. "I'm here to speak peace, not to impress you." The elder raised an eyebrow. Then she gestured for him to follow. Inside the hall, commanders and leaders waited with tight jaws and folded arms. Eric stood at the center, calm but alert. He placed the sealed message on the table and waited. No one moved. Then the elder opened it and read aloud. It was a royal command for cooperation. A request for unity, not control. It spoke of defense, not invasion. And most of all, it reminded them that the enemy fed on fear. The only way to win was to stand together. When the reading ended, the room remained quiet. Then one soldier stood. "You bled for one of them?" he asked Eric. Eric looked him in the eye. "I bled because someone needed protecting. That's what matters." The words were simple, but they landed hard. Another elder spoke. "You speak like one of us." Eric shook his head. "I speak like someone who's tired of watching good people suffer in silence." That was when the mood began to shift. The leaders saw him not as a symbol, but as a man who spoke truth. A signal came through just as they reached an agreement. A Shari vessel had entered orbit. The room turned to alarms. Eric stepped outside with the local guards and stared up at the dark sky. One massive ship floated there, silent and waiting. "Let me speak," Eric said. The commander hesitated, but allowed it. Eric walked to the outpost transmitter and opened a channel. He didn't wait for permission. He spoke into the cold air. "This colony is under protection. We're not afraid of you. If you want fear, you've come to the wrong place." The Shari didn't respond at first. Then a voice came back, cold and mechanical. "You are one. We are many." Eric smiled faintly. "Maybe, but one is enough if that one doesn't break." The silence returned. The Shari ship hovered for several more minutes. Then, to everyone's surprise, it turned and left. The colony stood frozen. No one spoke. Then the cheers began. Not for war, but for courage. Eric stepped back from the console, his body shaking. Karen appeared beside him. "You did it," she whispered. He looked up at the sky. "No, we all did it." The next morning, Eric received a call from the palace. Thalara's face appeared on the screen. She looked tired, but her smile was bright. "We heard what you did. The council is in shock." Eric smiled softly. "It wasn't just me." She laughed gently. "They think you're a legend now." Valana's face appeared. Next, she didn't smile, but her eyes were softer than ever. "You held a line without weapons. Used words instead of blades." "I didn't expect that from you," Eric replied. "Neither did I." She said nothing more, but her look stayed long. Thalanya spoke last. "You bought us time. That's more than most can say." Her voice held weight. "You've earned something more than praise. You've earned place." Eric didn't know what to say. For once he stayed quiet. Just listened. As the call ended, Eric walked out onto the cliffside near the colony walls. Wind rushed past him. The sun rose slowly, turning the sky into a golden sheet. He felt lighter, though the bruises were still there. He had come here without rank, without plan, without expectation. Now he had the attention of 3 royal sisters, the trust of a kingdom, and the hope of people he barely knew. All because he chose to stand when others ran, and the weight of that choice had just begun to show its reach. When Eric returned to the capital, the air felt different. Not just to him, but to everyone watching. The guards at the palace gates saluted without being told. The servants whispered his name when he passed. He had left as a guest. He returned as something more. Thalara greeted him first. She ran to meet him before the ship door even opened fully. Her eyes filled with relief. She didn't speak at first. She only touched his face and smiled. Then, in front of all the soldiers and crew, she hugged him tightly. Valana arrived second. She stood straight, arms folded, but her gaze gave her away. There was pride in her eyes. She stepped forward and placed her hand over the pendant still. Hanging from his neck, "You wore it," she said. "It worked," Eric replied. She didn't correct him. Thalinia entered the hangar later, walking with slow, deliberate steps. Her presence made everyone fall silent. She approached Eric and studied him for a moment. Then she placed her hand over her heart. "You did more than deliver a message," she said. "You changed their hearts. That is rare." The king summoned them to the Starlight Hall that evening. All four stood before him. Eric noticed how close the sisters stayed near him now. There was no distance, no separation. They stood together like equals. The king rose and looked at his daughters first, then at Eric. "You were sent to speak for us," he said. "But you returned with something far more valuable. Proof that unity is not found in bloodlines, but in actions." Eric bowed his head respectfully. He had nothing to say that would add more than the king had already spoken. After the ceremony, the palace held a quiet banquet. Only those close to the royal family were invited. Eric sat between Thalara and Valana. Thalinia sat across from him. The table was filled with food, laughter, and gentle music. But beneath the surface, emotions stirred quietly. Thalara leaned closer during the meal. "I thought of you every day," she said softly. "When the reports came, I feared the worst." Eric smiled gently. "I promised I'd come back." Valana added, "You kept that promise." And more. Later that night, Eric stood alone on one of the palace balconies. The stars above looked clearer than ever. He heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw Thalinia approach. She wore a different robe now, less formal, more personal. Her voice was calm when she spoke. "You were never meant to matter this much to us," she said. "But here you are." Eric didn't reply at first. Then he said, "I didn't come here to matter. I just did what felt right." Thalinia nodded slowly. "And that's why it worked." She moved beside him, placing her hand on the cold railing. "Each of us saw something in you, something different, something honest, that is not common in our world." Eric turned to her. "What do you see now?" Thalinia looked at him for a long time before answering. "I see a man who carries the weight of 3 hearts without asking for any of them." Before he could respond, she walked away. Her words stayed behind, heavy and sharp. Eric remained there, lost in thought. He had bonded with each sister in a different way. Thalara had trusted him first. Valana had tested him hardest. Thalinia had respected him last. But now they all looked at him the same, not as a visitor, not as a stranger, but as someone they wanted near. Someone who had risked everything for something he didn't even belong to. Later that night, a message came from the outer systems. Another Shari fleet had been sighted, but it wasn't attacking. It was retreating. Their scouts had reported changes. The humans were no longer seen as soft. The Varelians were no longer seen as divided. Something had shifted. Eric read the report in silence. Then he looked toward the royal wing. He didn't know what came next, but he knew he wouldn't walk alone. Thalara stood by the garden window, watching him from a distance. Valana leaned against the hallway wall, arms folded, her eyes waiting for his next move. Thalinia stood by the inner chamber, quiet, strong, and thoughtful. They all waited for the same thing. His choice. Asterisk. The morning sun rose slowly over the Varelian palace, casting soft golden light through the crystal windows. Eric stood near the central fountain in the garden where everything had started. The blade Thalinia gave him rested on his back. The pendant from Valana still hung around his neck. But today, his heart was heavier than ever. 3 sisters had shown him parts of their world, parts of their hearts. But none had asked for promises. None had forced him to choose. And yet, they were all waiting, not for war, not for duty, but for the answer only he could give. He walked the garden path slowly. First, he saw Thalara sitting by the water. She looked peaceful, brushing her fingers through the glowing petals floating in the pool. She smiled when she saw him. "The flowers opened early this season," she said. Eric sat beside her quietly. "You were the first to trust me," he said, "when you didn't have to." Thalara nodded. "Because you didn't hesitate to bleed for me." They sat in silence for a moment. Then she looked at him and said, "Gently, no matter what happens, I'll never forget what you gave me." He stood and walked the eastern wing. There he found Velana in the training hall, sparring with 2 guards. She moved with precision and speed, her strikes landing sharp and clean. When she saw Eric, she stopped and dismissed the others with a nod. "You came to say something," she said. Eric nodded. "You challenged me when I didn't understand your world. You made me fight harder than anyone else." Velana lowered her weapons, "because I wanted to see if you were real." She stepped closer, looking him in the eye. "You were." She handed him a cloth to wipe his hands. "I never needed saving," she said. "But I needed someone who wouldn't walk away." Eric didn't answer. He just gripped the cloth tightly. Velana turned and walked back to the mat, but she stopped halfway and said without looking back, "Whatever choice you make it with a whole heart." The last path led to the high balcony, where Thalinia stood with her arms behind her. Back, she faced the horizon, the wind moving her hair gently. She didn't turn when Eric arrived. "You stood before the council without fear," she said. "That earned you more than a title." Eric stepped beside her. "You saw the value in me before I even knew what I carried." Thalinia finally turned. Her face was calm but honest. "I saw a man who acted without expecting reward. That's rare here." She looked at him with steady eyes. "I respect that more than anything." Eric reached into his jacket and pulled out the royal token the king had granted him. "They say this makes me part of the court," he said. Thalinia nodded. "It makes you more than that. It makes you family." That evening, the king held a private gathering. Only the royal family and Eric were present. The table was quiet. Everyone waited for him to speak. Eric stood slowly, placing the token on the table. "I came here by accident. I stayed because of duty. But now I remain because of what I found." He looked at Thalara. "You showed me trust when I had no reason to expect it." He turned to Velana. "You tested me when I didn't know if I belonged." Then to Thalinia. "And you gave me purpose when I thought I had none." His voice was steady, clear, strong. "I can't choose between hearts that beat for the same reason. I can only choose to stay true to them all." The king raised his brow. "Then what do you ask of us?" Eric smiled slightly. "I ask for permission to remain, not as a guest, not as a symbol, but as a man who will continue to serve, protect, and love this family in the way I'm allowed." The king looked at his daughters. None protested, none spoke against him. Then the king rose. "Then you are no longer an outsider. You are Varelian, in name and bond." Eric bowed deeply. The sisters stood with him. Together, that night, under the silver moons, Eric walked the palace grounds. Thalara joined him first. Her hand slipped into his without a word. Then Velana appeared, standing beside him on the left. Her presence was strong, steady. Thalinia came last, quiet but warm, walking just behind them. They walked forward, not as royals and a human, but as something rare. Something fragile and powerful at once. A bond born of pain, tested by fire and sealed by truth. He had bled for one of them. Now all 3 stood by him, and he would never walk alone again.